Welcome to Poirot Stories, where Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot brings captivating mysteries to life.
In the grand halls of Ashbourne Manor, a haunting melody turns to silence when virtuoso violinist Clara Beaumont vanishes with her priceless Stradivarius. Was it a desperate escape from a shadowy past, or a deadly plot woven in secrets? A cryptic letter, a broken string, a blood-stained clue by the lake. Who among the glittering guests hides a killer's heart? Hercule Poirot unravels a web of love, betrayal, and hidden truths in a race against time. Will the music of justice prevail, or will the shadows of Ashbourne Hall bury the truth forever? Chapter 1. The Melody of Ashbourne Hall. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over the rolling lawns of Ashbourne Hall, a grand Elizabethan manor nestled in the heart of the Sussex countryside. Its ivy-clad walls, punctuated by mullioned windows, shimmered with an air of timeless dignity. Yet beneath the surface of its tranquil beauty, a restless undercurrent stirred. The occasion was the annual Ashbourne Music Festival, a 3-day affair that drew the finest musicians, composers, and patrons from across England to this secluded estate. The event, hosted by the venerable Lord Reginald Ashbourne, was famed not only for its performances, but for the glittering company it attracted: aristocrats, artists, and intellectuals, all mingling in a delicate dance of civility and ambition. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion of Hercule Poirot, had arrived at the hall that morning, invited by Lord Ashbourne himself, who had expressed a particular wish to meet the renowned Belgian detective. Hastings, however, had come alone, as Poirot had been detained in London by a trifling matter involving a stolen sapphire brooch. "A small case, mon ami," Poirot had said with a twinkle in his eye, "but one that requires the precision of Hercule Poirot." Hastings, accustomed to his friend's flair for the dramatic, had promised to keep him apprised of the festival's proceedings, though he secretly hoped for a weekend of music and relaxation rather than mystery. The grand drawing room of Ashbourne Hall was alive with the hum of conversation as guests gathered for the opening recital. Crystal chandeliers gleamed above, casting prisms of light across the polished oak floors. The room was a study in elegance. Damask curtains framed tall windows, and portraits of stern-faced Ashbourne ancestors gazed down upon the assembled company. At the center of it all stood a magnificent Steinway piano, its ebony surface reflecting the flickering candles that adorned the nearby tables. The air was thick with anticipation, for the evening's highlight was to be a performance by the celebrated violinist, Madame Clara Beaumont, whose virtuosity had captivated Europe. Greeting each guest with practiced warmth. His wife, Lady Margaret, a woman of delicate beauty and reserved manners, hovered at his side, her eyes darting nervously, as though expecting some unseen calamity. Their daughter, Miss Eleanor Ashbourne, a vivacious young woman of 22, flitted about the room, her laughter ringing like a bell. She was, Hastings noted, the darling of the younger set, her auburn curls and sparkling green eyes drawing admiring glances from several gentlemen. Among the other guests were figures of note. There was Sir Frederick Langley, a retired barrister with a penchant for Wagner and a reputation for bluntness. His wife, Lady Beatrice, a former opera singer, clung to his arm, her once lovely voice now reduced to a husky whisper. Then there was Mr. Julian Carver, a composer of some renown, whose brooding demeanor and sharp wit made him both intriguing and intimidating. Beside him stood Miss Sylvia Trent, a young pianist with a quiet intensity, her fingers twitching as though longing for the keys. Finally, there was Dr. Victor Hammond, a physician and amateur cellist, whose calm professionalism masked a keen observational eye. As the clock struck 8, the guests took their seats, and a hush fell over the room. Madame Clara Beaumont entered, her presence commanding instant attention. She was a woman of striking beauty, with raven hair swept into an elegant chignon and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. Her gown, a deep emerald silk, shimmered as she moved, and in her hands she carried her prized Stradivarius violin, its polished wood glowing under the candlelight. She bowed gracefully to the audience, then raised her bow to the strings. The first notes of Vivaldi's Spring filled the room, pure and vibrant, weaving a spell over the listeners. Hastings, no connoisseur of music, found himself entranced by the precision and passion of her playing. Each note seemed to dance in the air, delicate yet powerful, drawing gasps and murmurs of delight from the audience. For nearly an hour, Madame Beaumont held them captive, her performance a masterclass in artistry. But as the final notes faded, a curious incident disrupted the evening's harmony. Madame Beaumont, bowing to thunderous applause, suddenly swayed, her face pale. She clutched her violin tightly, her knuckles whitening, and for a moment it seemed she might collapse. Dr. Hammond rushed to her side, but she waved him away with a faint smile, murmuring something about the heat of the room. She retired to her quarters, leaving the guests in a state of murmured concern. The evening continued, though the violinist's sudden indisposition, coupled with the undercurrents of tension he had sensed among the guests, hinted at a deeper disquiet. As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Hastings lingered in the drawing room, his mind turning over the evening's events. He recalled a fleeting moment during the performance when Madame Beaumont's eyes had met those of Julian Carver, the composer. There had been a flash of something, anger, fear, or perhaps recognition, that had passed between them, so brief as to be almost imperceptible. And then there was Lady Margaret's nervous demeanor, her hands twisting the pearls at her throat as she watched the violinist. Even Miss Eleanor, so lively and charming, had seemed distracted, her laughter a touch too bright. Hastings resolved to write to Poirot at once, though he hesitated to call it a case just yet. "My dear Poirot," he began in his mind. "The setting is idyllic, the company refined, yet I sense a shadow over Ashbourne Hall." His thoughts were interrupted by a soft footfall behind him. Turning, he saw Miss Eleanor, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice low. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with Father earlier. You're a friend of Monsieur Poirot, aren't you?" "I am," Hastings replied, surprised by her directness. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the darkened corridor beyond. I think something dreadful is going to happen. Madame Beaumont. She's not what she seems. And there are secrets here, secrets that could ruin us all." Before Hastings could press her further, she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the hall. He stood frozen, his heart pounding. The tranquility of Ashbourne Hall, it seemed, was a fragile veneer, and beneath it lay a web of intrigue that only Hercule Poirot could unravel. Hastings retired to his room, his mind racing. He penned a hasty letter to Poirot, urging him to come to Ashbourne Hall at once. As he sealed the envelope, he glanced at his watch. 11:45 p.m. The night was still, save for the distant cry of an owl. Yet Hastings could not shake the certainty that the peace of the manor was about to be shattered. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the first note of a deadly symphony had been struck. Only Poirot, with his little gray cells, could hope to decipher the melody of secrets that awaited. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Act. The dawn broke over Ashbourne Hall with a deceptive serenity, the mist curling gently over the dew-kissed lawns, as though the estate were untouched. Posted his letter to Poirot at first light, entrusting it to the butler, Mr. Grayson, a stoic figure whose impassive demeanor seemed to mirror the very walls of the hall. The breakfast room was a hive of subdued activity when Hastings descended. The long mahogany table was laden with silver trays of kedgeree, poached eggs, and toast, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint scent of roses from the garden. Yet the atmosphere was strained, the guests' polite murmurs barely masking their disquiet. Lord Ashbourne presided at the head of the table, his silver hair catching the morning light, while Lady Margaret sat opposite, her delicate hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Eleanor, pale but composed, picked at her plate, her eyes flitting nervously toward the empty seat reserved for Madame Clara Beaumont. "Has Madame Beaumont not joined us?" Hastings ventured, addressing Lord Ashbourne as he took his seat. The host's smile was tight, his eyes flickering with something akin to unease. "She sent word that she is indisposed this morning, Captain. A touch of fatigue, no doubt, from last night's performance. Dr. Hammond has been to see her, and he assures me she will recover with rest." Dr. Victor Hammond, seated across from Hastings, nodded gravely. "A mild case of exhaustion," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I advised her to remain in her room until this evening's recital. The strain of travel and performance can be taxing, even for one so accomplished." Hastings nodded, though his instincts prickled. The doctor's explanation was plausible, yet Madame Beaumont's sudden pallor the previous evening had seemed more than mere fatigue. He glanced at Julian Carver, the composer, whose dark eyes were fixed on his coffee cup, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the table. Miss Sylvia Trent, the pianist, sat beside him, her expression unreadable, though her hands trembled slightly as she buttered her toast. Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, engaged in a murmured conversation, their voices too low to discern. The meal proceeded with forced civility, the clink of cutlery and porcelain filling the silences. Hastings, ever observant, noted the small details: Lady Margaret's untouched plate, Miss Eleanor's furtive glances toward the door, and the way Mr. Carver's jaw tightened whenever Madame Beaumont's name was mentioned. Something was amiss, and Hastings longed for Poirot's keen insight to unravel the threads of tension that wove through the room. After breakfast, the guests dispersed to prepare for the day's musical events, but Hastings lingered, his curiosity piqued. He decided to take a stroll through the gardens. Hope was pacing near a stone fountain, her auburn curls glinting in the sunlight. "Captain Hastings," she said, startled, her hand flying to her chest. "I didn't see you there." "Forgive me, Miss Ashbourne," he replied, tipping his hat. "I was merely enjoying the gardens." "You seem troubled. Is there anything I can do?" She hesitated, her green eyes searching his face as though weighing whether to trust him. "It's Madame Beaumont," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I went to her room this morning to check on her, but she wasn't there. Her bed was made, her belongings untouched, but she was gone, and her violin, her precious Stradivarius, was missing too." Hastings felt a jolt of alarm. "Gone. Have you informed your father?" "Not yet," she admitted, wringing her hands. "I didn't want to cause a panic, but something's wrong, Captain. I know it. She was frightened last night. I could see it in her eyes. And now she's vanished." Hastings' mind raced. A missing violinist, her prized instrument gone, and a house full of guests with their own secrets. It was precisely the sort of puzzle that would delight Poirot. "We must act discreetly," he said, adopting a calm tone to steady her. "I shall make inquiries. In the meantime, say nothing to the others. We don't want to alarm anyone prematurely." Miss Eleanor nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. As she hurried back to the house, Hastings resolved to investigate Madame Beaumont's room himself. He made his way to the guest wing, where the butler, Mr. Grayson, directed him to the violinist's quarters. The room was elegantly appointed, with a four-poster bed, a mahogany writing desk, and a window overlooking the lake. As Miss Eleanor had said, the bed was neatly made, and Madame Beaumont's belongings, a few gowns, a silver hairbrush, a small leather-bound notebook, were arranged with meticulous care. But there was no sign of the violinist or her Stradivarius. Hastings examined the room carefully, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. On the writing desk, he found a single sheet of music, its edges slightly curled. It was a handwritten score titled "Lament for a Lost Love," composed by Julian Carver. A faint smudge of ink on the corner suggested it had been handled recently. Tucked beneath it was a folded letter addressed to Madame Beaumont, in a bold, masculine hand. Hastings hesitated, then opened it, reasoning that the situation warranted such an intrusion. The letter was brief but revealing. "Clara, you cannot hide forever. The truth will come out, and when it does, you will regret your silence. Meet me to..." Continued his search. In the wardrobe he found a velvet-lined case, empty, save for a single, broken violin string, its end frayed as though snapped in haste. As he left the room, he encountered Dr. Hammond in the corridor, his medical bag in hand. "Captain Hastings," the doctor said, his brow furrowing. "Is something amiss? I was just on my way to check on Madame Beaumont again." "She's not in her room," Hastings replied, watching the doctor's reaction closely. "Miss Eleanor says she's vanished, along with her violin." Dr. Hammond's face paled, though he quickly regained his composure. "Vanished? Surely she's simply gone for a walk. The grounds are vast, and she may have needed solitude." "Perhaps," Hastings said, unconvinced, "but her absence is troubling, given her condition last night. I've sent for Hercule Poirot. He'll know what to make of this." The doctor nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "A wise decision, Captain. If anyone can find her, it's Monsieur Poirot." As the day wore on, the absence of Madame Beaumont cast a shadow over the festival. The guests whispered among themselves, their speculation growing more fevered with each passing hour. Lord Ashburn, informed of the situation by Hastings, ordered a discreet search of the grounds, but no trace of the violinist was found. By late afternoon, a sense of dread had settled over the hall, the once joyful anticipation of the festival replaced by a creeping fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a carriage rolled up the gravel drive, and Hercule Poirot stepped out, his small, neat figure unmistakable even in the fading light. His mustache was impeccably waxed, his patent leather shoes gleaming, and his green eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Mon ami Hastings," he called, his voice bright despite the gravity of the situation. "You have summoned Poirot to a most intriguing affair. Tell me everything, and omit not the smallest detail." Hastings recounted the events of the past 24 hours, from Madame Beaumont's performance to her sudden disappearance, the empty violin case, the letter from J.C., and the broken string. Poirot listened intently, his head tilted, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Hastings finished, Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. A disappearance, a priceless violin, a cryptic letter. "This is a puzzle worthy of Hercule Poirot," he said. "We shall begin at once. The little gray cells, they are already at work. And mark my words, Hastings, the truth lies not in what is seen, but in what is hidden." As the lamps were lit in Ashburn Hall, casting long shadows across the ancient walls, Poirot set about his investigation, his mind a beacon in the gathering darkness. At Ashburn Hall, carried a chill that seemed to seep into the very stones of the manor, as though the house itself sensed the disquiet that had taken hold of its inhabitants. Hercule Poirot, having arrived just as the last rays of sunlight faded, stood in the grand entrance hall, his small, immaculate figure a stark contrast to the towering oak doors and the somber portraits that lined the walls. His green eyes, sharp and inquisitive, surveyed the scene with a quiet intensity, while Captain Hastings, at his side, felt a surge of relief at his friend's presence. Poirot's arrival was like the striking of a match in a darkened room, illuminating the shadows of uncertainty that had gathered since Madame Clara Beaumont's disappearance. "Mon ami," Poirot said, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie, "you have painted a most intriguing picture. A violinist of renown vanished without trace, her Stradivarius gone, and a house full of suspects, each with their own little secrets. C'est magnifique. But we must proceed with order and method. First, I must see this room of Madame Beaumont, and then we shall speak with the players in this drama." Hastings led Poirot to the guest wing, where the violinist's room remained untouched since his earlier inspection. The butler, Mr. Grayson, stood sentinel at the door, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as he admitted the detective. Poirot stepped inside, his movements precise and deliberate, as though each step were part of a carefully choreographed dance. He surveyed the room with a slow, sweeping gaze, taking in the neatly made bed, the mahogany writing desk, and the empty velvet-lined violin case. "Tiens," Poirot murmured, pausing at the desk where the handwritten score of "Lament for a Lost Love" lay. He picked it up with gloved fingers, examining the smudged ink and the elegant script. "This composition, it is by Monsieur Carver, n'est-ce pas? And this letter?" He glanced at Hastings, who produced the note signed J.C. Poirot read it silently, his lips pursing slightly. "A rendezvous at midnight by the lake. Most suggestive. And this broken violin string, curieux, très curieux." He knelt beside the wardrobe, inspecting the empty case. "The Stradivarius, it is not merely an instrument, Hastings. It is a treasure, a piece of history. To take it suggests either desperation or calculation. We must discover which." Leaving the room, Poirot requested that Lord Ashburn assemble the guests in the drawing room. The host complied, though his face was clutched tightly. Miss Eleanor hovered near her mother, her eyes darting between the guests. Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice occupied a corner, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Julian Carver leaned against a bookcase, his dark eyes smoldering, while Miss Sylvia Trent sat at the piano, her fingers tracing silent patterns on the keys. Dr. Victor Hammond stood apart, his calm demeanor unshaken, though his gaze was watchful. Poirot took center stage, his small stature somehow commanding the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice clear and precise. "I am Hercule Poirot, and I have been called to Ashburn Hall to investigate the disappearance of Madame Clara Beaumont. A woman of such talent does not vanish without reason, nor does a Stradivarius vanish without purpose. I ask for your cooperation, for the truth, it lies among you." A murmur rippled through the room, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Let us begin with the events of last night. Who among you spoke with Madame Beaumont after her performance?" A heavy silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Dr. Hammond stepped forward. "I saw her briefly," he said. "As I mentioned to Captain Hastings, she appeared faint after her performance. I escorted her to a room and advised rest. She seemed agitated, but I attributed it to exhaustion." "Agitated, you say?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "In what manner?" "She was clutching her violin tightly, as though afraid to let it go," the doctor replied. "She thanked me but dismissed me quickly. I left her at approximately 10 o'clock. Poirot nodded, his gaze shifting to Julian Carver. "And you, Monsieur Carver? You are the composer of this Lament for a Lost Love, which was found in her room. Did you speak with Madame Beaumont?" Carver's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed he might refuse to answer. "We spoke briefly before her performance," he said at last, his voice low. "A professional discussion about her interpretation of my work. Nothing more." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as skepticism. "And this letter, signed J.C., requesting a meeting at midnight by the lake. It is your hand, non?" A gasp escaped Lady Margaret, and all eyes turned to Carver. His face darkened, but he did not flinch. "I wrote no such letter," he said firmly. "If someone used my initials, it was not me." "Curious," Poirot said. "I found the room empty, as I told Captain Hastings." Poirot's eyes softened, though his mind remained sharp. "And you saw nothing unusual? Nothing out of place?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Only the empty violin case. I thought she might have gone for a walk. But when I saw the case, I knew something was wrong." The detective paced slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the oak floor. "Let us establish a timeline," he said. "Madame Beaumont performed at 8, became ill at 9, was escorted to her room by Dr. Hammond at 10, and was gone by 8 this morning. Somewhere in those hours, she and her violin vanished. Who among you was awake between 10 last night and 8 this morning?" Sir Frederick Langley cleared his throat. "I retired at 11, but I couldn't sleep. I was up reading until nearly 1. My room faces the lake, and I saw no one outside." Lady Beatrice nodded. "I was asleep by 10:30, but Frederick's restlessness kept me awake. I heard nothing unusual." Miss Sylvia Trent spoke softly. "I practiced in the music room until midnight. The windows were open, but I saw no one by the lake." Poirot's gaze lingered on each speaker, as though weighing their words against an invisible scale. "And you, Lord Ashburn?" "Lady Margaret?" "We retired shortly after the performance," Lord Ashburn said. "The festival is taxing, and we needed rest. Lady Margaret nodded, her voice barely audible. I took a sleeping draught and was asleep by 10. Poirot clapped his hands, startling the room. Bon, we have a beginning. Now, I must examine the grounds, particularly this lake where Monsieur Carver, or someone using his initials, proposed a meeting. Hastings, you will accompany me. As the guests dispersed, their murmurs filled with unease. Poirot and Hastings made their way to the ornamental lake. The moon hung low, casting a silver sheen over the water, which rippled gently in the night breeze. Poirot knelt at the water's edge, his eyes scanning the ground. "Regarde, Hastings," he said, pointing to a faint indentation in the soft earth. A footprint, small and delicate, like that of a woman. And here. He plucked a single blade of grass, stained with a dark, sticky substance. Blood, perhaps? Or something else? Hastings' heart quickened. Do you think she was harmed? Poirot's expression was unreadable. It is too soon to say, mon ami, but one thing is certain. Madame Beaumont did not vanish of her own accord. There is a hand at work here. Accord. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The morning sun filtered through the heavy damask curtains of Ashbourne Hall, casting a lattice of light and shadow across the drawing room where Hercule Poirot had gathered the guests once more. The air was thick with unspoken questions, the elegance of the previous day's festivities now overshadowed by the mystery of Madame Clara Beaumont's disappearance. The guests sat in a semicircle of upholstered chairs, their faces a study in varying degrees of unease, curiosity, and defiance. Poirot stood before them, his small frame radiating authority, his mustache impeccably waxed, and his green eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity of a man whose mind was already piecing together the puzzle. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice clear and measured. We are faced with a most singular problem. Madame Beaumont, a woman of genius, has vanished, and with her, a Stradivarius of inestimable value. This is no mere accident, no caprice of an artist. It is a matter of design, and to uncover it, we must employ the little gray cells. I shall speak with each of you in turn, and I ask for the truth, for it is only through truth that we shall find our violinist. Captain Hastings, seated near the fireplace, watched his friend with admiration. Poirot's method was a marvel, calm, methodical, and unrelenting, peeling back layers of deception with the precision of a surgeon. Hastings had seen it countless times, yet it never failed to captivate him. He clutched a small notebook, ready to jot down any detail that might prove significant, though he knew Poirot's memory needed no such aid. Poirot began with Lord Ashbourne, who stood by the mantel, his silver hair catching the morning light. "Milord," Poirot said, inclining his head, "you are the host of this splendid festival. Tell me, what was your impression of Madame Beaumont before her disappearance?" Lord Ashbourne's brow furrowed, his hands clasped behind his back. "She was a remarkable talent, Monsieur Poirot. Her performance was the highlight of our opening night. I spoke with her briefly during the reception, and she seemed in high spirits, though perhaps a touch distracted. I attributed it to the demands of her profession." "Distracted, you say?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "In what way?" She kept glancing toward the door, as though expecting someone, Lord Ashbourne replied. "But she was gracious, as always. I saw her last when she retired after her performance, escorted by Dr. Hammond. Poirot nodded, turning to Lady Margaret, who sat rigidly at the end of her performance. I thought she looked unwell. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, as though sensing the weight of her unspoken thoughts. Merci, milady. And you, Mademoiselle Eleanor. He turned to the young woman who sat beside her mother, her auburn curls framing a pale face. Eleanor's green eyes met Poirot's, and she spoke with a quiet resolve. I told Captain Hastings yesterday that I was worried about her. During her performance, she seemed haunted. I can't explain it, but there was a tension in her, as though she were playing for her life. And then, when I found her room empty, I knew something terrible had happened. Poirot tilted his head, his expression unreadable. A most interesting observation, mademoiselle. You have the eye of an artist, perhaps, to see such subtleties. Did you speak with her at all? Only briefly, Eleanor admitted. I complimented her performance, and she thanked me, but her smile was strained. She seemed eager to be alone. Poirot moved on to Dr. Victor Hammond, who stood near the window, his medical bag at his feet. Doctor, you attended Madame Beaumont last night. You say she was agitated. Can you elaborate? Dr. Hammond's calm demeanor faltered for a moment, his eyes flickering to the floor. As I said, she was clutching her violin tightly, almost protectively. She spoke little, only thanking me for my concern. I checked her pulse. It was rapid, but not alarmingly so. I left her at 10 o'clock, as I told you. And you heard nothing from her room later, Poirot pressed. Nothing, the doctor said firmly. I retired to my own room shortly after. Poirot's attention shifted to Julian Carver, the composer, who leaned against a bookcase, his dark eyes smoldering with barely concealed impatience. Monsieur Carver, your score was found in Madame Beaumont's room, and a letter bearing your initials. You deny writing it, yet the evidence suggests a connection. What was your relationship with the violinist? Carver's jaw tightened, and he straightened, his voice sharp. I told you, Monsieur Poirot, I wrote no such letter. Clara, Madame Beaumont, and I were professional acquaintances. We collaborated on occasion, as artists do. I admired her talent, nothing more. Admiration, oui, Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. Yet the letter speaks of secrets and regrets. If not you, then who might have used your initials to summon her to the lake? I have no idea on my music. I heard nothing but the wind and the occasional night bird. I saw no one by the lake. Curieux, Poirot murmured. A house full of observant people, yet no one sees or hears anything of note. And yet, a woman and her violin vanish into the night. Finally, he addressed Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice, who sat together, their faces a mask of polite concern. Sir Frederick, you were awake until 1 o'clock, reading by your window. You saw nothing, heard nothing. Nothing, Monsieur Poirot, Sir Frederick said gruffly. The night was quiet, save for the usual sounds of the countryside. Lady Beatrice nodded, her husky voice barely audible. I was half asleep, but I heard no footsteps or voices. It was a peaceful night, until this morning's dreadful news. Poirot clapped his hands, startling the room. Bon, we have established a foundation. Now, I must ask you all to remain at Ashbourne Hall until this matter is resolved. The police have been informed, but it is Hercule Poirot who shall uncover the truth. I ask you to be vigilant and to report anything, however small, that may shed light on this mystery." As the guests dispersed, their murmurs filled with unease, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Mon ami, what do you make of these accounts?" Hastings frowned, flipping through his notebook. "They're all so vague, Poirot. No one admits to seeing or hearing anything significant, yet I can't shake the feeling that they're hiding something. Carver especially. He's too defensive about that letter." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Précisément, Hastings. It is not what they say, but what they do not say that interests me. The letter, the broken violin string, the footprint by the lake. These are the notes of our symphony, and they are not yet in harmony. We must listen closely, for the truth is in the silences." Poirot spent the afternoon examining the grounds once more, accompanied by Hastings. They returned to the lake, where the footprint and the stained blade of grass had been found. Poirot knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the indentation. "A woman's shoe, small and narrow," he said. "It matches the size of Madame Beaumont's slippers, which I observed in her room. But regardez, Hastings, there is another mark here, fainter but larger. A man's boot, perhaps?" Hastings squinted at the ground. "You think someone was with her?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, rising. "Or perhaps someone followed her. We must also consider the blood, or what appears to be blood. I have sent the grass to a chemist in the village for analysis. It may tell us more."
The lake. And someone knows where she is now. Back in the drawing room, Poirot requested to see Madame Beaumont's leather-bound notebook, which Hastings had noticed in her room. Mr. Grayson retrieved it, and Poirot flipped through its pages, his brow furrowing. The notebook contained musical notations, appointments, and cryptic phrases, one of which caught his eye. "J.C. knows. Must confront him. 10/9, midnight." The date was yesterday, the night of her disappearance. "Tiens," Poirot said, closing the notebook. "The plot thickens. Madame Beaumont intended to confront someone, likely Monsieur Carver. But why? And about what? We must tread carefully, Hastings, for the truth is a delicate thing, and we are surrounded by those who would prefer it remain hidden." As the day drew to a close, the atmosphere in Ashbourne Hall grew heavier, the guests' polite facades beginning to crack under the weight of Poirot's scrutiny. The detective, however, remained serene, his little gray cells working tirelessly to unravel the mystery of the vanishing violinist and her secret. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ashbourne Hall, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the library, where Hercule Poirot had chosen to conduct his next round of inquiries. The room, with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and the faint scent of old paper, seemed a fitting stage for the detective's methodical unraveling of the mystery. Captain Hastings stood by a globe in the corner, his notebook open, his pen poised to capture every word. The guests, summoned once more, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces betraying a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The disappearance of Madame Clara Beaumont had cast a pall over the festival, and Poirot's presence, like a storm cloud on the horizon, promised revelations that none seemed eager to face. Poirot, impeccable in his tailored suit and polished shoes, paced slowly before the group, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice as precise as a metronome.
We have established that Madame Beaumont vanished sometime after 10 o'clock last night, taking with her a Stradivarius of great value. We have a letter, a footprint, a broken violin string, and a notebook hinting at a confrontation, yet the truth remains elusive, hidden behind a veil of half-truths and silences. Today, we shall peel back this veil, for Hercule Poirot does not tolerate deception. His gaze swept the room, lingering on each guest as though reading the secrets etched in their expressions. The police, in the form of inspectors, interviewed the staff and searched the grounds. What is your conclusion? Davies cleared his throat, his voice gruff. It's plain enough, Monsieur Poirot. The violinist, Madame Beaumont, likely fled the estate. She was under strain, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. She took her valuable violin and slipped away in the night. The letter from this Carver fellow, he nodded toward Julian Carver, who bristled, suggests a quarrel. Maybe she didn't want to face him. We found no sign of foul play, no body, no blood beyond that speck on the grass, which could be anything. Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as suppressed amusement. A tidy theory, Inspector, Poirot said, but it lacks the elegance of truth. Madame Beaumont, a woman of fame and discipline, does not abandon her engagements without reason. And the Stradivarius, would she risk it in a hasty flight? No. There is more here than a simple escape. The inspector's face reddened, but he held his tongue, allowing Poirot to continue. The detective turned to Julian Carver, whose brooding presence seemed to dominate the room despite his silence. Monsieur Carver, the inspector believes you drove Madame Beaumont away. The letter bearing your initials suggests a confrontation, yet you deny writing it. Can you offer any explanation for this discrepancy? Carver's dark eyes flashed with irritation. I've told you, Monsieur Poirot, I wrote no such letter. Someone is using my name to muddy the waters. As for Clara, Madame Beaumont, I had no quarrel with her. Our discussions were about music, nothing more. Poirot tilted his head, his expression unreadable. And yet, her notebook mentions a need to confront J.C. on the night she vanished. If not you, then who? A murmur rippled through the room, and Hastings noted the sudden tension in Miss Sylvia Trent's posture. The young pianist, seated at a small writing desk, had been silent thus far, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Poirot's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. Mademoiselle Trent, you were in the music room until midnight, you say. The windows opened to the lake, where Madame Beaumont was to meet someone. Did you see nothing, hear nothing, that might enlighten us? Sylvia's fingers twitched, and she met Poirot's gaze with a forced calm. As I said, Monsieur Poirot, I was absorbed in my practice. The music room is secluded, and the night was quiet. I saw no one by the lake. Poirot nodded slowly, as though filing her words away for later scrutiny. He turned to Dr. Victor Hammond, whose calm professionalism seemed unshaken by the mounting tension. Rest. I left her in her room and heard nothing more. Poirot's eyes gleamed, and he paced a few steps, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. Let us consider the timeline once more. At 10, Madame Beaumont retires. At midnight, Miss Trent is practicing. Sir Frederick is reading, and the rest of the household claims to be asleep. Yet, a letter summons Madame Beaumont to the lake, and a footprint suggests she was there. Inspector Davies believes she fled, but Hercule Poirot believes otherwise. There is a design here, a pattern, and we must find its shape. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling over the guests like a fog. Inspector Davies, seizing the moment, stood and addressed the group. "I've spoken to the groundskeeper, Mr. Willis. He says he saw a figure near the lake around midnight. A woman, he thought, but it was too dark to be sure. He assumed it was one of the guests taking a stroll. That fits with my theory. Madame Beaumont, planning to leave, went to the lake to meet someone, then slipped away." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "A figure by the lake, most interesting. But why, Inspector, would she take her violin, only to leave it behind? The empty case in her room suggests it was taken, perhaps by force. And the broken string, does it not hint at a struggle?" Davies frowned, clearly unsettled by Poirot's logic. "It's possible, I suppose, but without a body we can't assume murder." "Précisément," Poirot said, his tone sharp. "We assume nothing. We observe, we question, we deduce." He turned to Miss Eleanor Ashbourne, whose pale face betrayed her anxiety. "Mademoiselle, you were the first to discover Madame Beaumont's absence. You mentioned her strained smile, her haunted look. Did you see her interact with anyone in particular last night?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting to her mother, Lady Margaret, who sat rigidly beside her. I saw her speaking with Mr. Carver before her performance. It seemed heated, though I couldn't hear their words. And later during the reception, she avoided him, as though uneasy. Carver's face darkened, but he said nothing. Poirot nodded, his mind clearly turning over this new piece of information. "And you, Lady Margaret? You were preoccupied, you said. But did you notice any such tension?" Lady Margaret's fingers tightened around her pearls, her voice barely audible. "I saw nothing specific, Monsieur Poirot. The evening was a blur of guests and duties. But I did notice Madame Beaumont seemed distant, as though her mind were elsewhere." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, sensing the weight of her restraint. He turned to Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice, who had remained largely silent. "Sir Frederick, you were awake until 1. Your room faces the lake. Did you see this figure the ground of the question?"
I saw nothing, Monsieur Poirot. My eyes were on my book, though I glanced out the window occasionally. The lake was dark, undisturbed. Lady Beatrice nodded, her husky voice strained. I was half asleep, as I said. I heard no footsteps, no voices. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Bon, we have a chorus of denials. Yet the truth is here, hidden in the silences. I propose a small experiment. Tonight, we shall recreate the conditions of last night. The music room windows will be open, the lake illuminated by lanterns. Perhaps the scene will jog a memory or reveal a liar." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Inspector Davies looked skeptical but said nothing. As the meeting adjourned, Poirot drew Hastings aside, his voice low. "Mon ami, the inspector's theory is a red herring, designed to distract from the truth. Madame Beaumont did not flee. She was taken, or worse. And the Stradivarius is the key. We must watch closely tonight, for someone in this house knows more than they say." Hastings nodded, his mind racing. "Carver's the obvious suspect, Poirot. The letter, the notebook, Eleanor's observation of their argument, it all points to him." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The obvious, Hastings, is rarely the truth. Carver is a convenient target, but we must look beyond the surface. The footprint, the blood, the broken string. These are the clues that will lead us to the heart of this mystery." As the guests dispersed, the library grew quiet, save for the ticking of the clock. Poirot stood by the window, gazing out at the lake,
his mind a whirl of connections and contradictions. The red herrings were plentiful, but Hercule Poirot was not a man to be swayed by misdirection. The truth, he knew, was waiting to be uncovered, and he would find it, note by note, in the symphony of secrets that enveloped Ashbourne Hall. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The evening at Ashbourne Hall descended with a hushed intensity, as though the very walls of the manor held their breath in anticipation of Hercule Poirot's next move. The grand dining room, where the guests had gathered for dinner, was aglow with candlelight, the flickering flames casting restless shadows across the polished mahogany table. The meal, though exquisitely prepared, was consumed in near silence, the clink of cutlery and the occasional murmur of conversation overshadowed by the weight of Madame Clara Beaumont's absence lingering in his mind. The guests, however, were less forthcoming than ever, their polite facades barely concealing their unease. Lord Ashbourne made valiant attempts to steer the conversation toward the festival's remaining events, but his words fell flat, and Lady Margaret's strained smile did little to lighten the mood. Miss Eleanor, pale and quiet, avoided meeting anyone's gaze, while Julian Carver's brooding silence seemed to cast a shadow over the table. Miss Sylvia Trent, her fingers restless, toyed with her napkin, and Dr. Victor Hammond maintained his professional composure, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice, seated together, exchanged occasional whispers, their expressions guarded. As the dessert course was served, a delicate lemon soufflé, Poirot set down his spoon and clapped his hands, the sound sharp and commanding. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "tonight we shall conduct a small experiment as I proposed earlier. The music room windows will be open, the lake illuminated by lanterns, and we shall recreate the conditions of last night. But first I wish to share a discovery, a detail that may illuminate our mystery." The guests leaned forward, their curiosity piqued despite their apprehension. Poirot reached into his pocket and produced a small, folded piece of paper, which he unfolded with deliberate care. It was a torn fragment of sheet music, its edges jagged, as though ripped from a larger score. "This," he said, holding it aloft, "was found this afternoon, caught in the reeds by the lake, near the footprint we discovered. It is a fragment of Lament for a Lost Love, the composition by Monsieur Carver found in Madame Beaumont's room. But regardez, this fragment bears a notation in her own hand, a single word. Forgive." A murmur rippled through the room, and Julian Carver's face paled, though he quickly masked his reaction with a scowl. "What does it mean, Monsieur Poirot?" Lord Ashbourne asked, his voice strained. "It means, milord," Poirot replied, "that Madame Beaumont was not merely a performer of this piece, but a participant in its story. The word forgive suggests a personal connection, a plea perhaps, directed at someone present. And the fact that this fragment was found by the lake where she was summoned is no coincidence." Inspector Davies leaned forward, his skepticism giving way to interest. "Are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot, that this note points to foul play?" "I suggest nothing, Inspector," Poirot said, his tone mild but firm. Lament for a Lost Love is yours. Can you tell us its inspiration? Perhaps it holds a clue to Madame Beaumont's state of mind." Carver's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed he might refuse to answer. "It's a piece about loss," he said at last, his voice low and clipped. a universal theme. I wrote it years ago, inspired by personal experiences. Clara, Madame Beaumont, chose to perform it because it suited her style. That's all. Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as skepticism. And yet, she wrote "forgive" on this fragment. To whom was she addressing this plea? To you, perhaps? I told you, I had no personal connection with her. Carver snapped, his voice rising. If she wrote that word, it's nothing to do with me. Miss Sylvia Trent, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, her voice soft but clear. Monsieur Poirot, may I see the fragment? Poirot handed it to her, his eyes never leaving her face. Sylvia studied it, her fingers trembling slightly. This handwriting, she said, it's definitely Clara's. I've seen her annotate scores before, but I don't know what "forgive" means. Perhaps it was a note to herself, a reminder. Perhaps, Poirot said, his tone enigmatic. Or perhaps it was a message meant for another. We shall see. The dinner concluded and Poirot led the group to the music room where the windows had been opened as he had requested. The lake beyond shimmered under the glow of lanterns placed along its edge, their light casting eerie reflections on the water. The groundskeeper, Mr. Willis, stood by ready to assist, while Inspector Davies and his men patrolled the perimeter, their presence a silent reminder of the gravity of the situation. Poirot positioned himself near the piano where Miss Trent had practiced the previous night. Mademoiselle Trent, he said, will you play for us, as you did last night? Let us recreate the scene exactly. Sylvia hesitated, then nodded, seating herself at the piano. Her fingers began to move, coaxing a soft, haunting melody from the keys, a piece by Chopin, delicate and mournful. The guests stood in silence, their eyes drawn to the lake where the lanterns flickered like stars. Poirot, however, watched the guests, his gaze darting from one to another, noting every reaction. As the music filled the room, Hastings noticed a subtle change in Lady Margaret's demeanor. Her hands, usually so tightly clasped, were relaxed, and her eyes were fixed on the lake, as though seeing something beyond the lanterns. Eleanor, too, seemed transfixed, her breath catching as the melody swelled. Julian Carver stood rigid, his jaw set. Summoned to the lake. Someone was there. Someone who left a footprint, a fragment of music, and perhaps a stain of blood. Who among you knows more than you have said? A heavy silence followed, broken only by a sharp intake of breath from Lady Margaret. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice trembling. I must confess something. Last night, after taking my sleeping draught, I woke briefly around midnight. I thought I heard voices by the lake, soft but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, and I assumed it was a dream, but now, I'm not so sure. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Voices, milady. A man and a woman, perhaps. I couldn't tell, she said, her hands twisting her pearls once more. It was so faint and I was groggy, but I swear I heard something. Poirot nodded, his mind clearly racing. A most valuable detail, milady. It confirms that Madame Beaumont was not alone by the lake. We are closer to the truth, but we are not there yet. As the guests returned to their rooms, Poirot drew Hastings aside, his voice low. Mon ami, the fragment of music is our first true clue. Forgive. It is a cry from the heart. But to whom? And why was it torn and left by the lake? We must also consider Lady Margaret's voices. She is nervous, perhaps hiding more than she admits. Hastings frowned, flipping through his notebook. Carver still the likely suspect, Poirot. The score, the letter, the notebook. All point to him, and Eleanor said their conversation was heated. But the obvious is often a distraction, Poirot replied. Carver is too convenient a villain. We must look to the silences, the hesitations, Lady Margaret's confession, Sylvia's recognition of the handwriting, even Dr. Hammond's calm. It all tells a story. The fragment is a key, Hastings, but it unlocks a door we have not yet found. As the night deepened, Poirot stood by the music room window, gazing out at the lake. The lanterns still burned, their light a beacon in the darkness, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the delicate interplay of clues and contradictions. The detectives' little gray cells were at work, and Hastings knew that the next revelation would bring them closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The morning light crept into Ashbourne Hall with a tentative glow, as though reluctant to illuminate the secrets that clung to its ancient walls. The dining room, where the guests had gathered for breakfast, was a study in strained civility, the clatter of porcelain and silver doing little to mask the undercurrent of unease. Hercule, Sylvia Trent's unnatural stillness, the absence of Madame Clara Beaumont, now 2 days gone, hung over the room like a specter, and Poirot's presence only sharpened the guests' apprehension. The detective had spent the previous night poring over the clues, the torn fragment of sheet music with the word "forgive," the cryptic letter signed J.C., the broken violin string, and the faint footprint by the lake. Lady Margaret's admission of hearing voices at midnight had added a new note to the symphony of deception, and Poirot was determined to uncover the hidden melodies of motive and opportunity. As the meal concluded, he rose, his small frame commanding the room's attention with an effortless authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot said, his voice clear and precise. "The disappearance of Madame Beaumont grows more complex with each passing hour. We have clues, yes, but also lies that conceal the truth like shadows conceal the light. Today, we shall probe deeper, for the heart of this mystery lies not only in what has been said, but in what has been withheld." Inspector Davies, seated near the door, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier theory of Madame Beaumont's voluntary flight now seeming flimsier in the face of Poirot's relentless logic. The detective turned to him first. "Inspector, have your men found anything new in their search of the grounds?" Davies shook his head, his tone grudging. "Nothing significant, Monsieur Poirot. We've combed the lake, the gardens, even the outbuildings. No sign of the violinist or her instrument. The blood on the grass you sent for analysis. It's human, type O, but that's common enough. Could be hers, could be anyone's." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of mild satisfaction. "Human blood, you say? Most interesting. It confirms that something occurred by the lake, something more than a simple departure. Merci, Inspector." He turned to the guests, his gaze settling on Julian Carver, whose brooding presence seemed to draw the room's tension like a magnet. "Monsieur Carver, you have denied writing the letter signed J.C., yet Madame Beaumont's notebook suggests she intended to confront you. And now, this fragment of your composition, marked with her plea for forgiveness. Can you shed light on any personal history between you?" Carver's eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. "I've told you, Monsieur Poirot, our relationship was professional. If Clara wrote forgive, it wasn't for me. Perhaps she had other secrets, other enemies. You're barking up the wrong tree." Poirot tilted his head, his expression enigmatic. Enemies narrowed, and he turned to Sylvia. "Mademoiselle Trent, you recognized Madame Beaumont's handwriting on the fragment. You and she were colleagues, oui? Did she ever confide in you about a personal matter? Perhaps a conflict?" Sylvia's fingers tightened around her coffee cup, and she spoke softly, her voice barely audible. "Clara and I were friendly but not close. She was guarded. She spoke of her music, her travels, but nothing deeply personal. If she had a conflict, she never mentioned it to me." Poirot nodded, though his gaze lingered on her, as though sensing the weight of her restraint. He turned to Miss Eleanor, whose pale face betrayed her anxiety. "Mademoiselle Ashbourne, you observed a heated exchange between Madame Beaumont and Monsieur Carver before her performance. Can you recall anything specific? Words, gestures, anything that might illuminate their relationship?" Eleanor's eyes darted to her mother, then back to Poirot. "I didn't hear their words," she said, her voice trembling. "They were standing by the piano, and Clara, Madame Beaumont, looked upset. She gestured sharply as though dismissing him, and he walked away, angry. That's all I saw." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. A gesture, a dismissal. Small things, yet they tell a story. "Merci, mademoiselle." As the breakfast adjourned, Poirot requested a private audience with Lady Margaret in the library. The room, with its towering bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains, seemed to cocoon them in a world of secrets. Lady Margaret sat on a leather armchair, her hands twisting her pearls, her eyes avoiding Poirot's. "Milady," Poirot said gently, "you heard voices by the lake at midnight, yet you hesitated to share this until pressed. Is there more you know? Something you fear to reveal?" Lady Margaret's breath caught, and for a moment it seemed she might break. "Monsieur Poirot," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, I've been trying to protect my family. This festival, it's everything to Reginald, his legacy, his pride. But there are things, old wounds, old promises, that I fear may have resurfaced." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes softening but no less penetrating. "Old wounds, milady? Speak plainly, I beg you." She hesitated, then spoke in a rush, as though the words had been damned too long. "Years ago, before I married Reginald, I knew Clara Beaumont. She was Clara Duval then, a young violinist, full of fire. We were friends, but there was a man, someone we both cared for. It ended badly, with bitterness and betrayal. I had chose me. She never forgave me for it. When I saw her speaking with Julian, I feared she might be stirring up old grudges, using him to hurt me." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. "And you believe this history may be connected to her disappearance?" "I don't know," Lady Margaret admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "But I saw the way she looked at me during the reception, like she hated me still. And now she's gone, and I can't help but wonder if I've brought this upon us." Poirot placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Courage, milady. You have given me a piece of the puzzle. It may yet fit." Leaving the library, Poirot sought out Hastings, who was pacing the terrace, his notebook clutched tightly. "Poirot," Hastings said, his voice low, "I overheard something just now. Sylvia Trent was talking to Dr. Hammond in the garden. She said something about Clara's debts and a dangerous man. They stopped when they saw me, but it sounded serious." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Debts, you say? And a dangerous man? Mon ami, you have done well. This is another thread in our tapestry. We must now speak with Mademoiselle Trent again." They found Sylvia in the music room, seated at the piano, her fingers tracing a silent melody. She started as Poirot entered, her expression guarded. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, his tone gentle but firm, "I have heard of debts and a dangerous man connected to Madame Beaumont. What do you know of this?" Sylvia's face paled and she hesitated before speaking. I didn't want to say anything, Monsieur Poirot. Clara confided in me a few weeks ago during a rehearsal in London. She was in debt, serious debt, to a man named Victor Rossi, a music promoter with unsavory connections. She said he was pressuring her to perform at private events, threatening to ruin her if she refused. She was terrified of him. Poirot's brow furrowed. "And this Rossi, was he here at the festival?" "I don't think so," Sylvia said. But Clara was nervous, always looking over her shoulder. She said she'd found a way to pay him off, but she wouldn't tell me how. Poirot nodded, his mind turning over this new information. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. As they left the music room, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Mon ami, the lies are unraveling. Lady Margaret's past with Clara, Sylvia's talk of debts and a dangerous man. These are not mere coincidences. The fragment, the letter, the blood, they all point to a deeper motive, one rooted in betrayal and desperation." Bathed Ashbourne Hall in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the estate, casting dappled patterns on the gravel paths. Yet within the manor, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The weight of Madame Clara Beaumont's disappearance, now entering its third day, pressed heavily upon the guests, their polite facades crumbling under the strain of Hercule Poirot's relentless inquiries. The dining room, where lunch had just concluded, was a scene of subdued tension, the clatter of dishes replaced by an uneasy silence as the guests awaited Poirot's next move. Captain Hastings, seated near a window overlooking the ornamental lake, felt the tension like a tightening knot. His notebook, now filled with scribbled observations, lay open before him, but his eyes were drawn to Poirot, who stood at the head of the table, his small, neat figure radiating an unshakable calm. The detective's green eyes sparkled with purpose, his mustache impeccably waxed, as though the gravity of the situation only sharpened his resolve. Inspector Davies, ever skeptical, hovered near the door, his presence a reminder of the official investigation that ran parallel to Poirot's own. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the silence like a well-tuned violin. "We have uncovered much in our pursuit of the truth. A letter, a fragment of music, a footprint, a stain of blood, and now secrets of debts and past betrayals. Yet the heart of this mystery remains hidden, locked within the emotions of those present. Today, someone will break, and in that moment, we shall glimpse the truth." The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another. Lady Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her napkin. Miss Eleanor's face was pale with dread, and Julian Carver's brooding intensity seemed to fill the room. Miss Sylvia Trent sat with her hands folded tightly, her expression guarded, while Dr. Victor Hammond maintained his professional composure, though his fingers tapped restlessly against the table. Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice, seated together, exchanged a glance that spoke of shared unease. Poirot's gaze settled on Sylvia Trent, whose revelation about Madame Beaumont's debts to Victor Rossi had added a new layer to the mystery. "Mademoiselle Trent," he said, his tone gentle but probing, "you spoke of Madame Beaumont's fear of this Victor Rossi, a man of unsavory reputation. Did she ever mention a specific plan to resolve these debts, or perhaps a meeting arranged with him?" Sylvia's eyes widened, and for a moment it seemed she might retreat into silence. But then, as though a dam had burst, she would settle her debt once and for all. I assumed she meant her Stradivarius, but she was vague, almost secretive. She said, "It's not just the violin. It's what it represents." I didn't understand, but she was desperate, and I didn't press her. Poirot's eyes gleamed, and he leaned forward slightly. "What it represents, you say? A most intriguing phrase. Did she mention anyone else in connection with this plan?" Sylvia hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Julian Carver, then back to Poirot. "She mentioned Julian, Mr. Carver. She said he knew something that could ruin her if it came out. I thought she meant their professional rivalry, but now, I'm not sure. When I saw them arguing before her performance, I feared it was about more than music." Carver's face darkened, and he rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough, Sylvia," he snapped, his voice raw with emotion. "You're twisting things, making me out to be a villain. I told you. My relationship with Clara was professional. If she was in trouble, it wasn't because of me." Poirot raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Monsieur Carver, sit, I beg you. Your anger is noted, but it reveals more than it conceals. If you are innocent as you claim, then help us understand. What did Madame Beaumont know that could ruin her? Carver sank back into his chair, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment he seemed on the verge of defiance, but then his shoulders slumped, and he spoke, his voice low and strained. "All right, Monsieur Poirot. I'll tell you what I know, but it's not what you think. Clara and I, we were more than colleagues once. Years ago, in Paris, we were lovers. It ended badly. She wanted more than I could give, and we parted with bitterness. When we met again for this festival, she brought it up, accusing me of betraying her. I told her to let the past go, but she wouldn't. That's what our argument was about, not some sinister plot." The room fell silent, the weight of Carver's confession settling over the guests like a fog. Lady Margaret gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, while Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. Sylvia looked down, her cheeks flushed, as though ashamed of her role in exposing Carver's secret. Dr. Hammond's calm facade flickered, his fingers pausing in their restless tapping, while Sir Frederick and Lady Beatrice exchanged a glance that suggested they too had secrets to guard. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Merci, Monsieur Carver. Your candor is—" Earlier revelation about her past with Clara had opened a new avenue of inquiry. "Milady," he said, his tone gentle but insistent, "you spoke of a shared history with Madame Beaumont, a love triangle involving Edward Carver, Monsieur Carver's father. Did you suspect that her presence here was motivated by revenge?" Lady Margaret's face crumpled, and tears welled in her eyes. "I feared it, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice breaking. "When I saw her speaking with Julian, I thought she might be using him to hurt me, to reopen old wounds. I confronted her during the reception after her performance. I begged her to leave the past alone, for the sake of my family. She laughed, a cold, bitter laugh, and said, 'The past is never gone, Margaret. It's in every note I play.' I was terrified, but I didn't know what she meant until she vanished." Poirot's eyes softened, though his mind remained sharp. "A most revealing confession, milady. Your fear, your confrontation, it adds another note to our symphony. But tell me, did you see her after this exchange?" "No," Lady Margaret whispered, wiping her eyes. "I went to my room and took my sleeping draught. I heard the voices later, as I told you, but I thought it was a dream." Poirot paced slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "We have a love lost, a debt unpaid, a past unburied. These are the threads of our mystery, and they are beginning to weave together. But there is more, I think, that one of you knows." He turned to Dr. Hammond, whose calm demeanor had begun to crack under the weight of the revelations. "Doctor, you were the last to see Madame Beaumont, escorting her to her room. Did she speak of these debts, this past, or this mysterious valuable item she planned to use?" Hammond's face tightened, and for the first time he seemed rattled. "She said nothing specific, Monsieur Poirot. She was agitated, as I told you, but she dismissed me quickly. I swear I know nothing of her plans or her disappearance." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of skepticism. "We shall see, Doctor. The truth has a way of revealing itself, even to those who hide it." As the guests dispersed, their emotions raw and exposed, Poirot drew Hastings aside, his voice low. "Mon ami, we have reached a turning point. Carver's confession, Lady Margaret's fear, Sylvia's revelation, they are cracks in the facade. Someone knows what happened by the lake, and tonight we shall press harder. The fragment, the blood, the letter, they all point to a truth that is no longer content to hide." Hastings nodded. "Debts, to the secrets that bind these people. The truth is near, mon ami, and we shall find it." As the day faded into evening, the guests' confessions echoed in Poirot's mind, each one a note in the growing crescendo of the mystery. The stage was set for the next act, and the detective knew that the truth was about to break free. Chapter 9. The Trap.
The evening at Ashburn Hall descended with a palpable tension, the air heavy with the weight of secrets laid bare and those yet to be uncovered. The grand drawing room, where Hercule Poirot had summoned the guests once more, glowed under the soft light of chandeliers, their crystal prisms casting fleeting rainbows across the oak-paneled walls. The room, so recently a stage for music and merriment, now felt like a courtroom, with Poirot as both judge and inquisitor. Captain Hastings stood near the fireplace, his notebook clutched tightly, his eyes fixed on his friend, whose calm demeanor belied the intensity of his purpose. The detective's plan, hinted at throughout the day, was about to unfold. A trap designed to coax the truth from the tangled web of lies and half-truths that enveloped the disappearance of Madame Clara Beaumont. The guests filed in, their faces a gallery of apprehension and defiance. Lord Ashburn, his silver hair gleaming, stood by the mantel, his expression one of strained dignity. Lady Margaret sat on a velvet settee, her hands clasped tightly, her pearls a silent testament to her nerves. Miss Eleanor, pale and silent, hovered near her mother, her green eyes darting nervously. Julian Carver leaned against a bookcase, his brooding intensity barely contained, while Miss Sylvia Trent sat at the piano, her fingers still, her expression guarded. Dr. Victor Hammond stood apart, his professional calm fraying at the edges, and Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice occupied a corner, their whispers hushed but urgent. Inspector Davies, ever the skeptic, stood by the door, his notebook open, ready to challenge Poirot's methods. Poirot stepped to the center of the room, his small frame commanding attention with an effortless authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice clear and deliberate. "We stand at a crossroads in our investigation. Madame Clara Beaumont has vanished, her Stradivarius with her, and the clues, a letter, a fragment of music, a footprint, a stain of blood, point to a truth hidden among you. Tonight, we shall apply a little pressure, for the truth, like a diamond, reveals its brilliance only under force. I have devised a small experiment to recreate the night of her disappearance, and I ask for your cooperation." A murmur rippled through the room, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Last night, we opened the music room windows and illuminated the lake, as it was when Madame Beaumont was summoned. Tonight, we shall go further. Each of you will recount your movements from 10 o'clock, when Dr. Hammond left Madame Beaumont in her room, to midnight, when Lady Performance. Can you confirm your movements?" Lord Ashburn nodded, his voice steady but strained. "As I said, Margaret and I retired shortly after 9:30. I was in my study until 10, reviewing festival accounts, then joined Margaret in our suite. I was asleep by 11. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And you heard nothing, saw nothing, of Madame Beaumont or anyone else?" "Nothing," Lord Ashburn said firmly. "The house was quiet." Poirot turned to Lady Margaret, whose hands trembled slightly. "Milady, you heard voices at midnight, yet you were under the influence of a sleeping draught. Can you be certain of what you heard?" Lady Margaret's voice wavered. I'm certain I heard voices, Monsieur Poirot. A man and a woman, I think, but it was faint, like a dream. I woke briefly, then fell back asleep." Poirot nodded, his gaze shifting to Miss Eleanor. "Mademoiselle, you were concerned for Madame Beaumont. Did you venture out that night, perhaps to check on her?" Eleanor's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head. "No, Monsieur Poirot. I stayed in my room after the reception.
I was restless, but I didn't leave until morning, when I found her room empty." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as skepticism. He turned to Julian Carver, whose dark eyes burned with barely concealed agitation. "Monsieur Carver, your history with Madame Beaumont has been revealed, a love affair, ended in bitterness. You deny writing the letter summoning her to the lake, yet her notebook suggests a confrontation with J.C. Where were you between 10 and midnight?" Carver's jaw tightened and he spoke through gritted teeth. "I was in my room, working on a new composition. I didn't leave, didn't see Clara, didn't write any letter. I've told you this." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet the letter exists, as does the fragment of your music, marked with her plea for forgiveness. Curious, no?" Carver said nothing, his silence a wall of defiance. Poirot moved on to Miss Sylvia Trent, whose guarded expression had begun to crack. "Mademoiselle, you were practicing until midnight. The music room faces the lake. Did you see or hear anything? Voices, perhaps, as Lady Margaret did?" Sylvia's hands clenched in her lap, and her voice trembled as she spoke. I may have heard something, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't mention it before because I wasn't sure. Around midnight, as I was finishing my practice, I thought I heard a muffled cry, like someone in distress. It was brief, and I convinced myself it was the wind or an...
Didn't want to believe something terrible had happened. I thought if I stayed silent, it might not be true. Poirot's expression softened, though his mind remained sharp. Fear is a powerful silencer, mademoiselle. But the truth cannot be suppressed forever. Merci for your candor. He turned to Dr. Hammond, whose calm facade was beginning to fray. Doctor, you left Madame Beaumont at 10. Did you return to her room? Or perhaps see her elsewhere that night? Hammond's fingers twitched and he spoke with measured calm. No, Monsieur Poirot. I retired to my room and read until 11, then slept. I heard nothing, saw nothing. Poirot nodded, then addressed Sir Frederick and Lady Beatrice. Sir Frederick, you were awake until 1, reading by your window. Lady Beatrice, you were restless. Did either of you hear this cry Mademoiselle Trent describes? Sir Frederick shook his head gruffly. Nothing, Monsieur Poirot. The night was quiet. Lady Beatrice's husky voice was barely audible. I heard nothing but Frederick turning pages. I was half asleep. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp in the tense silence. Bon. We have a cry, voices, a letter, and a missing violinist. Now, let us go to the lake where these events converged. The truth. It is near, and it will not escape Hercule Poirot. The guests followed Poirot and Hastings to the lake, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The lanterns, relit as they had been the previous night, cast a ghostly glow over the water, the reeds swaying gently in the breeze. Poirot paused at the spot where the footprint and the music fragment had been found, his eyes scanning the ground. Here, he said, pointing to the faint indentation, is where Madame Beaumont stood, and here, he gestured to a larger mark nearby, is the trace of another, perhaps her companion. Mademoiselle Trent, show us where you stood when you heard the cry. Sylvia, trembling, pointed to the music room window some 50 yards away. I was there, at the piano. The cry came from this direction, I think. Poirot nodded, then turned to the group, his voice rising with intensity. Imagine, mes amis, the scene. Madame Beaumont, summoned by a letter, comes to the lake at midnight. She meets someone. A man, perhaps, or a woman. There is a confrontation, a cry, a struggle. The violin string breaks, the music is torn, and she vanishes. Who was here with her? Who knows what happened? The guests stood frozen,
their faces pale in the lantern light. Suddenly, Miss Eleanor stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence. "Monsieur Poirot, I can't stay silent anymore. I saw something that night, from my window. It was just after midnight. I could..." Erupted in gasps, and Lady Margaret clutched her daughter's arm. Poirot's eyes blazed with triumph. "Mademoiselle, you have given us a vital piece of the puzzle. A struggle, a fall. This is no mere disappearance. We are close, mes amis, very close." As they returned to the hall, Poirot's mind was alight, the trap having sprung its first revelation. The truth was emerging, and the detective knew that the next act would bring the mystery to its climax. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The air in the grand drawing room of Ashbourne Hall was thick with anticipation, the flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows across the oak-paneled walls. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, immaculate figure commanding the attention of the assembled guests, who sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a gallery of fear, guilt, and curiosity. Captain Hastings, positioned near the fireplace, clutched his notebook, his heart pounding as he sensed the climax of the mystery approaching. The disappearance of Madame Clara Beaumont, now 3 days past, had unraveled secrets, exposed old wounds, and drawn forth confessions. And Poirot was poised to weave these threads into a tapestry of truth. Inspector Davies stood by the door, his skepticism tempered by a growing respect for Poirot's methods. The guests, Lord Ashbourne, Lady Margaret, Miss Eleanor, Julian Carver, Miss Sylvia Trent, Dr. Victor Hammond, Sir Frederick Langley, and Lady Beatrice, sat in uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on the detective. The revelations of the previous night, particularly Miss Eleanor's admission of witnessing a struggle by the lake, had shattered the fragile calm of the household, and now Poirot was ready to deliver his verdict. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and resonant, "we have reached the moment of truth in the affair of Madame Clara Beaumont's disappearance. For 3 days we have followed the clues. A letter signed J.C., a fragment of music marked Forgive, a broken violin string, a footprint by the lake, a stain of blood, and voices in the night. These are the notes of a symphony of deception, and now, with the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot, we shall play the final chord." He paced slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the floor, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us reconstruct the night of the crime. Madame Beaumont performs at 8, a triumph marred by her sudden pallor. At 10, Dr. Hammond escorts her to a room where she is agitated, clutching her Stradivarius. At midnight, voices are heard by the lake. Lady Margaret hears them faintly. Miss Trent hears a cry, and Miss Eleanor sees 2 figures, one falling, one dragging the other away. Midnight. "Monsieur Carver, you denied writing it, yet your history with Madame Beaumont, a love affair ended in bitterness, gave you motive. Her notebook mentioned a confrontation with J.C., and your score, Lament for a Lost Love, was found in her room, a fragment by the lake marked Forgive. But was it you?" Carver's face darkened, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched. Poirot continued, undeterred. "Then we have Mademoiselle Trent, who revealed Madame Beaumont's debts to Victor Rossi, a dangerous man. She heard a cry by the lake, yet hesitated to speak. Lady Margaret, you confess to a past rivalry with Madame Beaumont over Edward Carver, Julian's father, and a confrontation at the reception. Miss Eleanor saw a struggle, Doctor. Hammond was the last to see her, and Sir Frederick and Lady Beatrice claim to have seen nothing. A web of secrets, but the truth lies in the details. Poirot reached into his pocket and produced the torn fragment of music, holding it aloft. This fragment, marked "Forgive," is the key. It was not merely a plea, but a message, a confession. Madame Beaumont was not fleeing, nor was she abducted. She was murdered, here, by the lake, and her Stradivarius was taken to conceal a greater truth. A collective gasp filled the room, and Lady Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Inspector Davies stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Murdered, Monsieur Poirot. We found no body." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Patience, Inspector. The body is hidden, but the clues are not. Let us reconstruct the crime, step by step." Madame Beaumont was in debt to Victor Rossi, a man who threatened her ruin. She told Mademoiselle Trent she had something valuable, not just her violin, but what it represents. This was no mere instrument, but a symbol of her past, her secrets. She planned to use it to pay Rossi, perhaps by selling it. But someone else had other plans. Poirot turned to Julian Carver. "Monsieur Carver, you loved Madame Beaumont once, but she left you, and the wound never healed. When she arrived at Ashbourne Hall, she stirred those old feelings, accusing you of betrayal. But there was more. Your father, Edward Carver, was the man who broke her heart, choosing Lady Margaret instead. Madame Beaumont, in her bitterness, sought revenge, not against you, but against Lady Margaret, by threatening to reveal a secret that could destroy the Ashbourne family." Lady Margaret's face paled, and she clutched Eleanor's hand. Poirot's gaze shifted to Dr. Victor Hammond, whose calm facade shattered, his face ashen. "Doctor, you were not merely a physician, but a confidant of Edward Carver. You knew of this letter, did you not? And when Madame Beaumont arrived, you feared she would expose it. You escorted her to a room at 10, but you returned later, writing the letter signed J.C. to lure her to the lake, knowing it would implicate Julian Carver." Hammond's hands trembled and he shook his head. "No, Monsieur Poirot, you're mistaken." "Am I?" Poirot's voice was like steel. "The footprint by the lake. A man's boot, size 10, matches your shoes, Doctor. The blood, type O, matches Madame Beaumont's, confirmed by the chemist. The cry Miss Trent heard, the struggle Miss Eleanor saw. It was you. Confronting Madame Beaumont, demanding the letter. When she refused, you struck her, and in the struggle her violin string snapped. The music was torn. You killed her, hid her body, and took the Stradivarius to retrieve the letter." Hammond staggered, his voice hoarse. "No, I didn't mean to. She wouldn't listen. She was going to ruin everything." The room erupted in chaos. Lady Margaret sobbing, Eleanor clutching her mother, and Carver leaping to his feet. Inspector Davies moved swiftly, restraining Hammond, who collapsed, his confession spilling forth. "I only wanted the letter," he gasped. "Edward was my friend. I promised to protect his secret. Clara was going to sell it to Rossi. I begged her to stop, but she laughed and I lost control." Poirot's eyes softened, though his voice remained firm. "You took her life, Doctor, and hid her body in the lake, weighted with stones from the garden. The police will find her, I am certain. The Stradivarius is likely in your room, with the letter still inside." Davies nodded, signaling his men to search Hammond's quarters. The guests sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth settling over them. Poirot turned to them, his voice calm once more. "The tragedy of Madame Beaumont was one of desperation and revenge. She sought to right old wrongs, but in doing so she met a man whose loyalty to a dead friend drove him to murder. The little gray cells have prevailed, mes amis, as they always do. As Davies led Hammond away, Poirot drew Hastings aside, his voice low. Mon ami, the heart is a dangerous thing, is it not? Love, betrayal, loyalty. They weave a deadly web. Hastings nodded, his mind reeling. You knew it was Hammond all along, didn't you? Would never be the same. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after Dr. Victor Hammond's confession dawned over Ashbourne Hall with a quiet solemnity, as though the manor itself mourned the unraveling of its secrets. The golden light of late summer filtered through the tall windows of the library, where Hercule Poirot sat in a high-backed leather chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his green eyes contemplative. Captain Hastings stood by a bookshelf, his notebook closed for the first time in days, his mind still reeling from the dramatic revelation of the previous evening. The air was heavy with the aftermath of truth, the guests subdued, their voices hushed as they prepared to depart the estate, forever changed by the tragedy of Madame Clara Beaumont. The police, under Inspector Davies' direction, had worked through the night, recovering Madame Beaumont's body from the depths of the ornamental lake, just as Poirot had predicted. Weighted with stones from the garden, it had been concealed in a shallow trench among the reeds, a grim testament to Dr. Hammond's desperate act. The Stradivarius, too, had been found in Hammond's room, hidden inside a locked medical bag, along with the letter from Edward Carver, a confession of an affair that would have shattered Lord Ashbourne's reputation. The festival, once a celebration of music and refinement, had ended in scandal, and the guests were eager to leave its shadow behind. Poirot, however, remained serene, his mustache impeccably waxed, his demeanor one of quiet satisfaction. He had invited Hastings to join him in the library for a final conversation before their departure, a ritual Hastings knew well, a moment for the detective to reflect on the case and share the philosophy that guided his remarkable mind. Mon ami, Poirot said, his voice soft but clear. The affair of the vanishing violinist is concluded, yet it leaves us with much to ponder. The human heart, it is a labyrinth, is it not? Love, betrayal, loyalty. These are the forces that drive men and women to acts both noble and terrible. Hastings nodded, settling into a chair opposite Poirot. It's a grim business, Poirot. Dr. Hammond seems so composed, so professional. I never would have suspected him, not with all the suspicion on Carver. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. The obvious, Hastings, is rarely the truth. Monsieur Carver was a convenient scapegoat. The letter signed J.C. The history of love and bitterness, the heated argument observed by Mademoiselle Eleanor. But the little gray cells, they saw beyond the surface. The boot instrument. How did you guess about the letter hidden in its case? Poirot's eyes twinkled. It was Mademoiselle Trent's words, mon ami. It's not just the violin, it's what it represents. Madame Beaumont was desperate to pay her debts to Victor Rossi, yet she spoke of something more valuable than the Stradivarius itself. A letter, hidden for years, a confession that could ruin a family. This was the true treasure, and Dr. Hammond knew of it. His agitation when I pressed him about Madame Beaumont's plans, his too perfect calm. These were the signs of a man guarding a dangerous secret. Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. But how did you know the body was in the lake? There was so little evidence, just a footprint and a drop of blood. Poirot raised a finger, his expression one of gentle admonishment. Not so little, Hastings. The footprint, small and delicate, matched Madame Beaumont's slippers. The larger boot print, size 10, matched Dr. Hammond's shoes. The blood, type O, confirmed by the chemist, was hers. The cry heard by Mademoiselle Trent, the struggle seen by Mademoiselle Eleanor. These pointed to a violent act by the lake, and the stones, disturbed in the garden nearby, suggested a means to conceal a body. The lake was the only logical hiding place, for Dr. Hammond had little time to act before dawn. Hastings shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. You make it sound so simple, Poirot, but I was lost in the red herrings. Carver's past, Lady Margaret's rivalry, Sylvia's hesitation. You saw through it all. Poirot's smile widened, though his eyes were somber. The red herrings. They are the spice of a mystery, Hastings, but they cannot obscure the truth from Hercule Poirot. Each clue, the broken violin string, the torn music fragment, the forged letter, was a note in a symphony of deception. But the truth, it has a harmony of its own, and the little gray cells, they hear it clearly. He paused, gazing out the window at the lake, now tranquil in the morning light. Madame Beaumont was a woman of passion and pain, driven by old wounds and new desperation. Her plan to sell Edward Carver's letter was her undoing, for it threatened Dr. Hammond's loyalty to a friend and the Ashbourne family's honor. In his panic, he committed a terrible act, believing it would protect the past. But the past, mon ami, it cannot be silenced. It speaks through the clues, through the silences, through the heart. Hastings nodded, his mind turning to the guests whose lives had been irrevocably altered. What will happen to them now, Poirot? Lady Margaret, Eleanor, Carver, they're all carrying the weight of this. Poirot sighed, a rare moment of melancholy crossing his features. Heart. For his love for Madame Beaumont, though ended, left its mark. As for Mademoiselle Trent, her courage in speaking the truth has set her free, though she will mourn her friend. The truth, Hastings, it is both a burden and a liberation. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Lord Ashbourne entered, his face weary but grateful. Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I cannot thank you enough. You've saved my family from ruin, though at such a cost. The festival is ended, but Ashbourne Hall will recover thanks to you. Poirot inclined his head, his expression humble yet proud. It is my duty, my lord, to bring order to chaos, to find the truth where it hides. I am only sorry that it came at so great a price. As Lord Ashbourne left, Poirot rose, adjusting his tie with a precise flick of his fingers. Come, Hastings. Our work here is done. The train to London awaits, and there are other mysteries, other symphonies, waiting for Hercule Poirot. Hastings followed, his heart lighter but his mind still turning over the case. As they stepped into the hall, the sound of a distant piano drifted through the air. A soft, mournful melody, perhaps a final tribute to Madame Beaumont. Poirot paused, listening, then smiled faintly. Music, Hastings. It speaks when words fail. And so does the truth. With that, the detective walked toward the door, his small figure silhouetted against the morning light, leaving Ashbourne Hall to its healing silence. The mystery of the vanishing violinist was solved, but its echoes would linger, a reminder of the delicate balance between love, loyalty, and the secrets that bind them. Chapter 12. The Aftermath. The quiet of Ashbourne Hall was almost oppressive as the morning sun rose higher, casting long rays through the tall windows of the morning room, where the remaining guests had gathered for a subdued breakfast. The grandeur of the manor, with its polished oak floors and ancestral portraits, seemed diminished, as though the revelation of Dr. Victor Hammond's crime had drained the life from its very walls. Hercule Poirot, ever the picture of composure, sat at the table with a cup of café au lait, his green eyes observant but softened by a rare melancholy. Captain Hastings, seated opposite, felt the weight of the previous night's revelations pressing upon him, his notebook now tucked away, its pages filled with the details of a tragedy that had shaken the household to its core. The guests were fewer now, their numbers diminished by the departure of Dr. Hammond, who had been taken into custody by Inspector Davies. Ashbourne's reputation was now in the hands of the authorities, its contents discreetly handled to spare the family further scandal. Yet the air remained heavy with grief and unspoken questions, the festival's joy forever tainted by the shadow of murder. Lord Ashbourne, his silver hair disheveled for the first time, presided over the table with a weary dignity. Lady Margaret, her face pale and drawn, sat silently, her hands no longer clutching her pearls but resting limply in her lap. Miss Eleanor, though pale, showed a quiet resolve, her green eyes meeting those of the others with a newfound strength. Julian Carver, his brooding intensity softened by the weight of truth, ate sparingly, his gaze distant. Miss Sylvia Trent, her hands still trembling from her role in exposing Clara's secrets, stared at her untouched plate, while Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice maintained a stoic silence, their whispers confined to private moments. Poirot, sensing the need for closure, set down his cup and addressed the group, his voice gentle but clear. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "the tragedy of Madame Clara Beaumont has been laid bare, and the truth, though painful, has been found. Dr. Hammond, driven by loyalty to a dead friend and fear of scandal, committed a terrible act. Yet we must not let this darkness overshadow the light of justice. You have all played a part, however small, in bringing this truth to light, and for that, Hercule Poirot commends you." Lord Ashbourne cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "Monsieur Poirot, your clarity of mind has saved us from further ruin. I confess I feared the worst when Clara disappeared, but I never imagined such betrayal from one we trusted." Poirot inclined his head, his expression humble. "Betrayal, milord, is often cloaked in trust. Dr. Hammond believed he was protecting you, but his loyalty was misguided, and it led to tragedy. The little gray cells, they see through such cloaks, but they cannot undo the pain they reveal." Lady Margaret, her voice trembling, spoke softly. "Clara and I, we were friends once, before jealousy and heartbreak divided us. I never wished her harm, yet I feel responsible. If I hadn't confronted her, perhaps—" Poirot raised a hand, his tone soothing. "No, milady. The fault lies not with you, but with the choices of others. Madame Beaumont's desperation, Dr. Hammond's fear, these were the forces that led to her fate. You must not carry their burden, Eleanor." Her voice steady despite her pallor added, "I should have spoken sooner, Monsieur Poirot. I saw the struggle by the lake, but I was afraid. If I had acted, perhaps the emotion. Clara and I, we hurt each other years ago. I thought I'd moved past it, but seeing her here, it brought it all back. I didn't kill her, but I failed her. I should have seen how desperate she was." Poirot nodded, his gaze penetrating but kind. "The heart, Monsieur Carver. It holds memories that reason cannot erase. You are not to blame for her choices, nor for Dr. Hammond's actions. But you must learn from this and let it guide you to a better path. Sylvia Trent, her eyes brimming with tears, spoke softly. Clara was my friend, and I kept her secrets too long. I thought I was protecting her, but I only made things worse. How do I live with that? Poirot leaned forward, his voice gentle. Mademoiselle, you spoke the truth when it mattered most. That is a gift to your friend, a way to honor her memory. Guilt is a heavy burden, but it can be lightened by forgiveness of yourself and of others. Sir Frederick Langley, his blunt manner softened by the ordeal, added, We all saw things, heard things, but we looked away. This house, it's full of secrets, and they've cost us dearly. Lady Beatrice nodded, her husky voice barely audible. We thought we were above it all, but we're as human as anyone. Clara's death, it's a reminder of that. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound a gentle call to attention. Précisément, mes amis. The human heart is frail, yet resilient. You have faced a darkness, but you have also faced the truth. Ashbourne Hall will heal, as will you if you allow it. As the breakfast concluded, the guests began to prepare for their departure, their bags packed, their farewells subdued. Poirot and Hastings lingered in the morning room, the detective gazing out at the gardens, where the roses still bloomed despite the tragedy. Mon ami, Poirot said, his voice reflective. This case, it reminds us that the past is never truly gone. It lives in the choices we make, the secrets we keep. Madame Beaumont sought to escape her past, but it found her, as it always does. Hastings nodded, his mind turning over the events of the past days. It's a sad story, Poirot. Clara, Hammond, the Ashbournes, all caught in a web of their own making. But you untangled it as always. Poirot's smile was tinged with melancholy. The little gray cells, they do their work, but they cannot erase the pain they uncover. Yet there is beauty in order, in truth, even when it is painful. We have restored that order, Hastings. Music of Ashbourne Hall play on. As the carriage rolled down the gravel drive, Hastings glanced back at the manor, its ivy-clad walls glowing in the sunlight. Do you think they'll recover, Poirot? The Ashbournes, Carver, Sylvia? Poirot's eyes twinkled, though his voice was somber. The heart, it heals, Hastings, as the seasons turn. They will find their way, as we all must. And now to London, where other mysteries await. The carriage carried them away, the echoes of Ashbourne Hall fading into the distance. A place forever marked by the tragedy of the vanishing violinist, yet redeemed by the clarity of Hercule Poirot's little gray cells. Chapter 13. The Echoes of Truth. The midday sun hung low over Ashbourne Hall, its golden rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the estate's drive, casting a soft, forgiving light on the manor's ivy-clad walls. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn, as though nature itself sought to soothe the wounds left by the tragedy of Madame Clara Beaumont's murder. Hercule Poirot, preparing to depart for London, stood on the terrace, his small, neat figure silhouetted against the rolling lawns. His polished shoes gleamed, his mustache was impeccably waxed, and his green eyes held a quiet contemplation, as though he were listening to the final notes of a symphony only he could hear. Captain Hastings, ever his loyal companion, stood beside him, his suitcase at his feet, his mind still turning over the events that had unfolded over the past days. The guests, now diminished in number and spirit, were making their final preparations to leave. The Ashbourne Music Festival, once a beacon of culture and refinement, had ended in scandal and sorrow, its melodies drowned out by the discord of betrayal and death. The police, led by Inspector Davies, had completed their work, securing Dr. Victor Hammond's confession and ensuring the evidence, Madame Beaumont's body, the Stradivarius, and Edward Carver's incriminating letter, was properly documented. The letter, a painful relic of a past affair, had been handled with discretion, sparing Lord Ashbourne's family further public humiliation, though the private wounds would linger. Inside the morning room, where the remaining guests had gathered for a final farewell, the atmosphere was one of subdued reflection. Lord Ashbourne, his silver hair now seeming more a mark of weariness than authority, stood by the window, gazing out at the gardens. Lady Margaret, her delicate beauty marred by grief, sat with her hands folded, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Miss Eleanor, showing a quiet strength, moved among the guests, offering polite words of parting. Julian Carver, Sir Frederick Langley, and Lady Beatrice, their stoic facades intact, prepared to return to their own lives, their whispers now silenced. Poirot, invited to join the guests for a final cup of tea, entered the room with Hastings, his presence both comforting and commanding. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice clear and measured. "Our time at Ashbourne Hall draws to a close, but before we part, I wish to reflect on what we have learned. The truth, it is a mirror, revealing not only the crime but the hearts of those it touches. Madame Clara Beaumont's death was a tragedy, but it has shown us the power of secrets and the necessity of facing them." Lord Ashbourne turned from the window, his voice heavy with gratitude. "Monsieur Poirot, you have given us clarity where there was only chaos. The loss of Madame Beaumont is a wound that will not easily heal, but your work has preserved what remains of our family's honor. For that, we are eternally grateful." Poirot inclined his head, his expression humble yet proud. "It is my duty, milord, to bring order to disorder. The little gray cells, they see what others overlook, and they cannot rest until the truth is known." Lady Margaret, her voice soft but steady, spoke next. "I blamed myself, Monsieur Poirot, for Clara's death, our past, the bitterness between us. It haunted me. But you've shown me that her fate was not my doing. How can I thank you for that?" Poirot's eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. "Milady, the past is a shadow, but it need not define you. You have faced your regrets, and in doing so you have found strength. That is thanks enough." Eleanor stepped forward, her green eyes bright with determination. "Monsieur Poirot, I was afraid to speak, but you showed me the importance of courage. I'll carry that lesson with me always." Poirot smiled faintly, a rare warmth in his expression. "Mademoiselle, courage is the melody of the soul. You have found yours, and it will guide you well." Julian Carver, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice low and raw. "Clara's death, it's made me see things differently. I was angry, bitter, but I didn't want her gone. I wish I'd told her that, before." He trailed off, his eyes distant. Poirot's gaze was kind but penetrating. "Monsieur Carver, the heart speaks too late sometimes, but it is never too late to learn. Let Madame Beaumont's memory be a reminder to live with honesty, even when it is painful." Sylvia Trent, setting down her pen, looked up, her voice steady despite her grief. Clara was my friend. The ordeal added, "You've shown us, Monsieur Poirot, that no one is above the truth. This house, this festival, it'll never be the same, but perhaps that's for the best." Lady Beatrice, her husky voice barely audible, agreed. "We've all been changed, for better or worse. Your clarity, Monsieur Poirot, has given us a chance to start anew." Poirot clapped his hands, the sound a gentle call to closure. "Mes amis, the echoes of this tragedy will linger, but they will also fade. Ashbourne Hall is a place of beauty, of music, and it will sing again if you let it." Hercule Poirot takes his leave, but he leaves you with this: the truth, though painful, is the foundation of healing. As the guests dispersed to finalize their departures, Poirot and Hastings stepped onto the terrace where their carriage awaited. The detective paused, gazing out at the lake, its surface now calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. "Mon ami," he said, his voice reflective, "this case, it reminds us that the heart is both fragile and fierce. Madame Beaumont sought to right old wrongs, but she stirred a storm she could not control. Dr. Hammond, in his loyalty, became a murderer. And yet, in their pain, the others have found a path to redemption." Hastings nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "It's a sad story, Poirot, but you brought light to it. The Ashbournes, Carver, Sylvia, they'll carry on, thanks to you." Poirot's smile was tinged with melancholy. "The little gray cells, they do their work, Hastings, but they cannot erase the sorrow. Yet they can restore order, and that is enough. Come, the train to London awaits, and there are other mysteries to unravel." As the carriage rolled away, Hastings glanced back at Ashbourne Hall, its towers standing proud against the sky. The manor had been a stage for tragedy, but also for truth, and Poirot's presence had transformed it. The echoes of Madame Beaumont's violin, though silenced, would live on in the lessons learned, a quiet melody of justice and hope. Chapter 14. The Final Notes. The afternoon sun cast a warm, forgiving glow over Ashbourne Hall, its rays dancing across the manicured lawns and reflecting off the still waters of the ornamental lake, where the tragedy of Madame Clara Beaumont had come to its grim conclusion. The manor, though steeped in the echoes of recent sorrow, seemed to exhale a tentative sigh of relief, as if the truth uncovered by Hercule Poirot had lifted a veil of darkness. The detective, preparing for his final departure, stood Victor Hammond's crime. The recovery of Madame Beaumont's body and the discovery of Edward Carver's letter had brought closure. Yet the scars left on the inhabitants of Ashbourne Hall were undeniable. The festival, once a celebration of music and prestige, had ended in silence, its guests departing with heavy hearts and newfound resolve. In the drawing room, where Poirot and Hastings had been invited for a final farewell, the remaining guests gathered, their faces a mixture of gratitude and grief. Lord Ashbourne, his silver hair now neatly combed, stood with a renewed sense of purpose, as though determined to rebuild what had been tarnished. Lady Margaret, her delicate beauty softened by relief, sat beside him, her hands no longer clutching her pearls but resting gently in her lap. Miss Eleanor, her auburn curls catching the light, showed a quiet strength, her green eyes bright with determination. Julian Carver, his brooding intensity replaced by a somber introspection, stood near the piano, his fingers tracing its keys as if seeking solace in music. Miss Sylvia Trent, her earlier tremors gone, sat with a notepad, sketching a melody, perhaps a tribute to her lost friend. Sir Frederick Langley and Lady Beatrice, their stoic facades softened, prepared to leave, their whispers now replaced by quiet nods of acknowledgement. Poirot, sensing the need for a final word, stepped forward, his voice clear and resonant. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said. "The curtain falls on the tragedy of Ashbourne Hall, but the music of truth will linger. Madame Clara Beaumont's life was ended by desperation and betrayal. Yet through your courage, your confessions, your confessions, your silence is broken. You have restored order to this place. Hercule Poirot takes his leave, but he leaves you with this. Let the lessons of this tragedy be your guide, and let the music of Ashbourne Hall play once more." Lord Ashbourne stepped forward, his voice steady but warm. "Monsieur Poirot, you have given us more than justice. You have given us a chance to heal. The festival may be ended, but Ashbourne Hall will rise again, and we owe that to you." Poirot inclined his head, his expression humble. "It is the work of the little grey cells, my lord, to bring clarity where there is confusion. I am honored to have served Lady Margaret." Her eyes glistening, spoke softly. "Clara and I were bound by a painful past, but your work has freed me from its shadow. I can mourn her now, not as an enemy, but as a friend lost." Poirot's gaze softened. "Mourning, milady, is that you have found yours, and it will guide you well." Julian Carver, his voice low and reflective, added, "Clara's death has made me see my own failings. I let bitterness cloud my heart, but I want to honor her memory by creating something beautiful. Music that speaks of forgiveness." Poirot nodded, his eyes penetrating but kind. "Monsieur Carver, art is the soul's redemption. Let your music be a tribute to Madame Beaumont, and to the truth you have faced." "Hello." Sylvia Trent, setting down her notepad, spoke with quiet resolve. "Clara was my friend, and I failed her by keeping silent. But you, Monsieur Poirot, gave her a voice through justice. I'm writing a piece for her, a requiem. It's the least I can do." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of approval. "Mademoiselle, your music will keep her memory alive. That is a gift beyond price." Sir Frederick Langley, his blunt manner softened by the ordeal, said, "You've shown us, Monsieur Poirot, that secrets destroy but truth rebuilds. We'll take that lesson with us." Lady Beatrice, her husky voice steady, added, "This house will never forget what happened, but it will also never forget you." Poirot clapped his hands, the sound a gentle punctuation to the moment. "Mes amis, the notes of this tragedy have been played, but the melody of life continues. Let Ashbourne Hall be a place of renewal, where music and truth prevail." As the guests offered their final farewells, Poirot and Hastings stepped into the entrance hall, where the butler, Mr. Grayson, stood with their coats. The stoic man who had witnessed the drama unfold bowed slightly. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, safe travels. Hello, you've brought light to a dark time." Poirot tipped his hat, his voice warm. "Merci, Monsieur Grayson. The light of truth is the greatest gift we can offer." Outside, the carriage awaited, its horses pawing the gravel drive. As Poirot and Hastings settled in, the detective gazed out at the manor, its towers standing proud against the sky. "Mon ami," he said, his voice reflective. "This case, it reminds us that the human heart is both fragile and enduring. Madame Beaumont sought to escape her past, but it claimed her. Dr. Hammond sought to protect a secret, but it destroyed him. Yet those who remain, they have found strength in the truth. Hastings nodded, his heart lighter despite the sorrow. You gave them that strength, Poirot. The Ashbournes, Carver, Sylvia, they'll rebuild because of you. Poirot's smile was tinged with melancholy. The little gray music, Hastings, he murmured. It speaks where words fail. And so does the truth. The manor faded into the distance, its secrets laid bare, its future uncertain but hopeful. The final notes of the tragedy had been played, and Hercule Poirot, ever the maestro of truth, rode on to the next mystery, his little gray cells already attuned to the next symphony. Chapter 15. The Departure. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the rolling lawns of Ashbourne Hall, as the carriage bearing Hercule Poirot and Captain Arthur Hastings trundled down the gravel drive, leaving the manor behind. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, the leaves of the ancient elms tinged with amber, as though nature itself mourned the tragedy that had unfolded within the estate's ivy-clad walls. Poirot, seated with his usual impeccable posture, gazed out at the receding towers of the hall, his green eyes reflective, his mustache a perfect crescent of wax. Hastings beside him clutched his suitcase, his mind still entangled in the intricate web of secrets, betrayal, and justice that had defined their time at Ashbourne. The resolution of Madame Clara Beaumont's murder had brought a bittersweet closure to the household. Dr. Victor Hammond's confession, the recovery of Clara's body from the lake, and the discovery of Edward Carver's scandalous letter had laid bare the motives and mistakes that led to her death. The Ashbourne Music Festival, once a beacon of culture, had ended in silence. Its guests, departing with hearts heavy, but minds enlightened by the truth Poirot had uncovered. The manor, though scarred, stood poised for renewal, its future resting in the hands of those who had faced their pasts with courage. Inside the carriage, the rhythmic clatter of hooves provided a soothing counterpoint to the silence between the two men. Hastings, ever the faithful chronicler, broke it first, his voice tinged with awe. Poirot, this case, it's one for the books. The way you pieced it all together, from the letter to the footprint to that hidden letter in the violin case, it's nothing short of genius. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, his fingers adjusting the brim of his hat. Mon ami, you flatter me, but it is merely the work of the little gray cells. The truth, it is like a melody, each clue a note, each lie a discord. Hercule Poirot listens, and he finds the harmony. Hastings shook his head, a wry grin spreading across his face. You make it sound so simple, but I was lost in the fog. Carver's past with Clara, Lady Margaret's old rivalry, Sylvia's hesitation. You saw through it all, right to Hammond's guilt, heart, but also a distraction. The footprint, the blood, the broken violin string, these were the true notes, and they led to Dr. Hammond, a man whose loyalty to a dead friend drove him to murder. Hastings leaned back, his gaze drifting to the countryside rolling past. It's a sad story, Poirot. Clara, desperate to escape her debts, stirred up a past that cost her life. Hammond, trying to protect a secret, lost everything. And the Ashbournes, Carver, Sylvia, they're left to pick up the pieces. Poirot nodded, his voice soft but resolute. The human heart, Hastings, it is both fragile and fierce. Madame Beaumont sought to right old wrongs, but she awoke a storm. Dr. Hammond believed he could silence the past, but it spoke through his actions. Yet those who remain, Lord Ashbourne, Lady Margaret, Mademoiselle Eleanor, Monsieur Carver, Mademoiselle Trent, they have faced their truths, and in that, they will find strength. The carriage approached the small village station, where the train to London awaited, its steam rising like a sigh into the clear sky. As they disembarked, Hastings glanced back toward Ashbourne Hall, now a distant silhouette against the horizon. "Do you think they'll recover, Poirot?" "The manor, the festival, it's been shaken to its core." Poirot paused, his hand resting on the handle of his suitcase. "Ashbourne Hall is a place of beauty, mon ami, and beauty endures. The festival may pause, but it will return, as music always does. Lord Ashbourne will rebuild, Lady Margaret will heal, and Mademoiselle Eleanor will lead with courage. Monsieur Carver will compose again, his music tempered by truth. Mademoiselle Trent's requiem will honor her friend. They are wounded, oui, but the heart, it mends with time and purpose." Hastings nodded, his heart lighter despite the weight of the tragedy. "You gave them that purpose, Poirot. Without you, they'd still be lost in lies." Poirot's smile was humble, though his eyes gleamed with pride. "The little gray cells, they do their work, Hastings. They bring order to chaos, light to darkness. But they cannot erase the sorrow, only illuminate the path forward." As they boarded the train, the whistle blew, a sharp, clear note that seemed to echo the resolution of the case. The compartment was cozy, its velvet seats a stark contrast to the somber events they left behind. Poirot settled in, producing a small book of poetry from his pocket, a rare indulgence. Hastings, curious, leaned forward. "Poetry, Poirot? That's new." Poirot chuckled softly, his fingers tracing the book's countryside blurring past, his thoughts lingering on Ashbourne Hall. "Clara's violin," he said softly. "It was more than an instrument, wasn't it?" "It was her voice, her story," Poirot nodded, his eyes distant. "Oui, Hastings. The Stradivarius was her heart, and the letter within it was her secret. She played her final note, but it was heard, and it led us to the truth. That is the power of music, of art. It speaks even in silence." As the train gathered speed, the rhythm of the wheels seemed to echo the melody of the case, a haunting refrain of loss and redemption. Poirot closed his book, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind already turning to the next challenge. "To London, mon ami," he said, his voice bright with anticipation. "The world is full of mysteries, and Hercule Poirot is never idle." Hastings smiled, settling back in his seat. The tragedy of the vanishing violinist was over, its secrets laid bare, its lessons etched in the hearts of those left behind. Ashbourne Hall would heal, its music would return, and Poirot, the maestro of truth, would continue his work, unraveling the symphonies of the human soul, one mystery at a time. The train carried them onward, the final notes of Ashbourne Hall fading into the distance, a poignant reminder that even in the darkest of mysteries, the truth could sing.